Hello, welcome to the Cult Bar, folks. We've had some fun technical difficulties this evening already, folks.
Oh yeah,
yeah. So we're gonna go as long as all this works. Feel like a bit of a house of cards here. So yeah. Mm-mm. All right. Well, Renee, we got a lot to get to. So what are you drinking there? What do you got?
Okay, so as you know, I had a drink plan that I couldn't make happen, but in case I can make it happen for our last Jonestown episode, I'm not going to say what it was. I am going to say that I feel a little bit bad about what I ended up with because, as a rule, for two reasons, I don't like Kool-Aid jokes. One, if you watch the fucking documentary, you understand, it's not funny. And two, I'm a fucking pedantic bitch, and it was not Kool-Aid. It was, in fact, Flavor Aid. But I discovered today you cannot buy individual packets of off-brand Kool-Aid anymore, and Flavor Aid seems not to exist. If you want to not buy Kool-Aid, you have to get a can. Yeah. So I got my raspberry lemonade Kool-Aid and some 7-Up. I put it directly into the 7-Up. That's why it's such a beautiful color. Because 7-Up dampens the flavor quite a bit. And then 2 shots of vodka.
Sweet. Nice luminescent color. So how is it?
It's really good, actually. The 7-Up dissolved some of that Kool-Aid, some of the powder flavor or something. I could have used the whole pack. I didn't. No, I couldn't have. Maybe I could have used a little bit more than I did. Okay. Let's say that. But I eyeballed it.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Well, hey, as long as it's drinkable, because some of the drinks I've had on this show have been pretty sketchy.
I think if I had done it with water instead of 7-Up, we would have had I had visions of myself being like, oh, turns out I don't like Kool-Aid as an adult.
Yeah, Kool-Aid was something that was prevalent in my house as a kid because it was inexpensive, and
Oh my God, the way that my stepdad made Kool-Aid, the fact that I don't have tons of health issues is just surprise. We always had Kool-Aid, but we had to make it. We made half hot water because he put more sugar in it than required, and you had to put hot water to make it dissolve, and the top was cold. But I realized when I bought this, I looked at the back. You're supposed to put a whole cup of sugar for 1 packet and 2 quarts of water.
Wow!
And he put more than that in our Kool-Aid growing up. So.
All right, hooray, diabetes. Or diabetes. Yeah. Well, that's something I didn't realize how much sugar was. I mean, those things were super sweet when you're a kid, but everything was filled with sugar back then. It still is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but that was back before people realized juvenile diabetes was a thing, I think. So, yeah. All right, so I was going to make a mixed drink. I decided against it because I found this. The Deacon. This is a blended whiskey. The reason I got it is not because he was a deacon or anything like that, but deacon is another word for pastor. But it's the fact that it's a death mask. Just he was the angel of death to all those folks. So yeah, this is actually a blended Scotch whiskey, so that makes me happy. I thought it was a blended Irish whiskey, but it has a cool little lid. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh yeah. That's nice.
But it's a very textured bottle, which is kind of nifty. But
I have a really cool bottle of single barrel whiskey that I need to bring on this show, but I have not figured out how to work it in.
Yeah, it's I was like, man, I really need a mixed drink. And I was just not feeling like making a mixed drink. So I was
you can order neat scotch at the bar.
Yeah. But it was just something where I was just, man, I'm not feeling up to making a mixed drink. So, yeah. So
last episode of the documentary today, it brought you down.
Yeah. Smells very good, though. Not super peaty. I generally like very peaty scotches. This is blended, so it's going to be much softer, and usually they're a bit sweeter on that end. But it definitely does have some smokiness to it, which is nice. Okay, that is really lovely. I'm very pleasantly surprised
I was on the edge of my seat because I could tell you were surprised, but I couldn't tell if it was good surprise or bad surprise.
No, it's interesting. It is sweet, but it's also smoky. So, yeah, got a little echo going there, but I think it just works itself out. That's very good. I'm very happy with that. So some of the drinks I've had to really muscle through in this show, and thankfully that will not be one of them.
Lots of them were this color.
Yeah, so we do have some news. Unfortunately, I cannot open the link because it keeps crashing my browsers.
You're going to have to trust that we really got that this is a real news story, I guess. Before we go into the news story, I'm going to do like our blanket of trigger warnings because there's trigger warnings for the news story as well. For the news story, your general cult stuff, coercive control, religious and spiritual abuse. In this case, child abuse and murder. Sorry. No, she's not. I'm sorry. What am I talking about? This one doesn't have murder. Our actual documentary trigger warnings do have child murder, unfortunately. Murder of all kinds. Talk of suicide, drug abuse, spiritual abuse, relationship abuse, you name it. This is tragedy on a scale that's very hard to imagine. This is about half of 9/11 is about what we're looking at. And, we'll get into why it's particularly awful, but it's particularly awful. So this is one, I know I talked to Doug about it, like just watching the documentary was a very emotional and difficult experience. It was very well done, no knocking on it. So, we're going to get into some really tough topics and it's pretty emotional. So if you have to excuse yourself, excuse yourself. News that you're going to have to believe is news. It's from theexpress.com, which I guess I also have to kind of believe it's news. I don't know anything about this source, but it came up in my little app when I looked for cult news. So in 2023, a woman named Kimberly Dell Davidson Drolet.
Wow.
Yeah. Sold her car. 3 days later, she withdrew all the money from the account, gave it to her sister, and she took her 18-month-old daughter to her adult son's house. She's got kids of all ages, it looks like. He's 30 years old. And then they fucking disappeared. And she was able to hide the girl for, I think it was 2 years. Although, I gotta say this, it says she was 2 when she left and now she's 5, so something's wrong in this news story, but I don't know what element is wrong. Anyway, the 5-year-old girl was found at a compound run by religious cult leader Paul Dean, not Paula, not the cult of butter and white supremacy, but a different one. They call it a FLDS type cult. And then they talk about what the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believes, which is kind of weird because, like, there's a lot of fundamentalist Mormon cults and they're all a little different. So if you want to know more, that guy's name is Paul Dean, and he runs what he has called Native American churches. He is not, to my knowledge, Native American. So that's interesting. I don't know if it's got anything to do with some of the weirder beliefs about the early Mormons' relationship with Native Americans. It's the Mormons with the weird beliefs, for the record, on that one. Anyway, the cult leader has not been charged. It's just the mother. So we don't really, like, the article does not get into what exactly her deal was, why she was kidnapping her daughter. It does appear it was her father who reported the child missing and, led the charge. So it's likely, I think, that it was a difference in religious beliefs that led to the mother wanting to kidnap the daughter. And yeah, that's about it. But real weird stuff. And it looks like this cult is still active. It's still going because the leader is not in any kind of trouble at all. So we will probably hear more about them, which probably isn't a good thing, but Again, if you are interested in what they're about, his name is Paul Dean. Dean.
Dean. Okay.
Yeah.
Because Paula Dean is Deen, I think. So.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
I just thought it was funny because the names were so close. Like.
Yeah. Have you seen pictures of Paula Dean recently?
No.
Let's just say Ozempic is featuring heavily in that.
Oh. So, wow.
Yeah.
I don't know if she needs Ozempic. She could literally just stop. If she just cut butter out of her diet, it would probably be like millions of calories a year.
Maybe she did. It just looks like the stereotypical folks who take Ozempic and lose a boatload of weight right away.
Oh yeah, too much.
You know what I mean? Like really fast, so their skin is a little bit.
You can't do that when you're Paula Dean's age.
No, you should not do that.
Well, I just mean like skin wise, but also yes, health wise, probably also.
Well. The thing is, side note, if you take Ozempic and you start taking it, if you want to keep the weight off, you basically have to take that until you
forever. Yeah.
You don't get to like jump off of it, and then because if you do, you just gain all the weight back. So that was your public service announcement for today.
Like literally every weight loss tactic that's ever been scientifically studied, it doesn't work forever unless you follow it to the letter every day until you die, and most people cannot do it.
And to be fair, unless it's a medical thing, like if you don't do it, you die. You shouldn't follow everything to the letter every day. You should be able to have your days where things aren't, perfect.
You have to drink 3/4 of a packet of Kool-Aid and 7-Up with vodka if you want to.
You should be able to do that, right? And you gave yourself a nice, healthy glass of that. So good for you. So. All right. So anyway, that's little tangents like as we do because, we're us. So we're going to do that shit.
The only way we're going to have fun is if we go on tangents because this was not a fun documentary. It was probably about 1,000 times better than the one we watched last month, based in fact, which is a good start.
That's a good start.
Definitely held Jim Jones accountable, which
is good.
I don't know how you don't. It's Jonestown, but.
Yeah. So there's a lot to get to. As usual, I took way too many notes. Although this time, I will say normally, if there's an hour of a docuseries and an hour episode, it takes me an hour and a half to get through it because I have to pause and type. Mm-hmm. And I did not do that this time. And I still had lots of notes.
I did it a couple times because I wanted exact quotes. Because I think what I'll say about this documentary, if you didn't have a chance to watch it in advance, which you probably didn't, I don't know. It is told exclusively from the perspective of people who were there. There are a handful of people who were at Jonestown attempting to leave on the day of the massacre, and then the survivors of the shooting on the airstrip who were part of Congressman Leo Ryan's group that had gone to see if anything wrong was going on there, which spoiler alert, right? But yeah, so it's, oh, and sorry. And then the last episode is told, some of it is told from the perspective of the American soldiers who were sent there to clean it up, which, as I told a friend of mine, had I only seen those interviews, they probably would have been some of the toughest interviews I've ever watched in my life. But I watched the previous 2 episodes of this documentary, so it was sort of like, well, that's bad, but
yeah. Yeah. And not to downplay what those folks had to do to clean up, because that had to be horrendous, but live through it had to be way worse.
Exactly.
So. All right.
A callback to our first episode, right? Or not our first episode, sorry. The first documentary you and I talked about that caused this show to exist. Congressman Leo Ryan's daughter was a Rajneeshi. We talked about it on that episode, but they interview her on some journalist or another, because it was at the time the Rajneeshi thing was going on. Interviewed her and asked her, what do you think your dad would say? And she's like, I think he'd be fine with it because it's nothing like Jonestown is fine.
That's right. I remember now that you said that. I didn't realize that was Leo Ryan's kid, because that's
so weird.
That's fucked up.
God, her mother must just be like,
what is going on? Oh, yeah. All right. So the thing is this kind of ostensibly takes place the day of the massacre. There's a little foreshadowing, kind of getting Leo Ryan there, but that I think moves pretty quickly. Like, you agree?
Well, they kind of, I mean, Stephen Jones, which is spelled Stefan, so I'm gonna probably say it wrong like 30 times in this episode, so I apologize.
Well, you never hear his name said; you just see it typed out, so we don't know for sure how it's pronounced.
Well, I know a couple people said Stephen in there.
Oh, that's true. So I would say if it's an A at the end, it's Stefan.
Right. Anyway, so Jim Jones' son, the only biological child Jim Jones had, and I think the only surviving child, but I could be wrong. He did make a comment that, we talked about so much last month, that you kind of need the context to understand, or it seems like these people are a bunch of idiots and they're not, right? And so they did talk a little bit. It didn't start in Indiana where the People's Temple actually started, but it kind of picked up in California with the segregated neighborhood that they founded, and if you can think back, the meme that goes around about Mr. Rogers having the black mailman share the kiddie pool with him and what a big deal that was. Mm-hmm. This is a church where white people and black people are hugging and singing together and worshiping together and living in the same neighborhoods. It was a big deal, and it seemed very progressive and like they were getting things done. And then we hear from, and I have her name somewhere way late. Is it Grace? Yeah.
Grace Stone.
Grace Stone says, she left before the Guyana stuff because he was starting to go a little crazy. And we do know that from books like Jeff Gwynn's Road to Jonestown and other documentaries. He started with some weird stuff before that. Mm-hmm. So she left Jonestown prior. She never went to Guyana until the visit with Leo Ryan. And then we just sort of kind of jumped to Guyana, where he found this place. And at the time, most of the members who went with him thought it was an amazing idea, amazing concept. They were proud to be a part of it. They were going to grow all their own food, have free medical care, live rent-free, and just build this utopia of mixed races, and it was going to be so happy. And there's some evidence that was true for a while.
Yeah, I one of my notes I made was that I could see the appeal of this in the early stages of it. The idea of it all being sort of integrated and everybody together, and we're going to build this society that we want where everybody has an equal say, and I could see the appeal of that. Like, I would love to have that now. Like, if I could, that would be
great. Just free healthcare, right? And you got to think
healthcare would be very nice.
They're literally building the buildings and like doing a lot of infrastructure. And I think there's like a definite feeling of camaraderie and accomplishment that is coming from doing that might distract from some of the other stuff that's going on with the higher ups. We do hear from, I have his name in the wrong place though. Hold on. Goodness.
You mean, is it Tom Bogue?
Yes.
I think it's pronounced Bogue, Bogue.
Yeah. So you hear from Tom Bogue, who was a child there, and he said no, like he felt his childhood was stolen from him. He did not have good, happy memories of Jonestown, but there are people who did. So like anything, I'm sure, and being a kid in that environment, depending on how you're parented, makes a big difference. And as Stefan says, he saw a side of his father that the followers didn't, and he kind of could clock that the reason he was making decisions about how the families needed to be separated and how all these things need to happen is because he was threatened by people basically getting anything out of a relationship that wasn't a relationship with him.
Yep.
And that his memories of Jonestown were that it was great until his dad moved in permanently.
Yeah, that was a kind of an interesting piece where he said it was all set up, and then my dad came and everything changed. And that was that's not an exact quote, but you're right. He was like saying it was great, and then he showed up and everything changed. So
yeah, and then I do want to say this really fucking pissed me off. Let me tell you, there's a few things that really pissed me off. Not about the documentary, but about the actual things that happen. Grace Stowen is the one that contacted Leo Ryan and said she believed people were being held there against their will, that she was hearing things that didn't sit right with her. It seemed bad. And so they get this group together. It's Leo Ryan, his assistant, who is a woman named Jackie Spear?
Speier. So Spire makes sense to me.
Who's kind of, I mean, she's pretty fucking badass, but we'll get to that.
Yeah.
And then like 3 different groups of journalists, right? Like there was an NBC camera crew, another camera crew. There was Don Harris, and is it Charlie Krause was the other journalist?
Yeah, his last name was Krause.
Charles Krause, yeah.
Krause.
And then they had staff as well. There was cameramen, there was, all this stuff, right? So they're going to go, and she's telling them, she's on the plane with them, and she's telling them, listen, this is going to be dangerous. Our lives are at risk. This is dangerous. And they're like, okay, lady. Okay. It's probably not great there or whatever, or maybe it's bad, but it's not that bad. And she said someone actually told her to shut up. And so she did at that point because they weren't listening to her. And Charles Krause says it didn't seem possible that it could be that bad. Which this is, first clue that things are pretty bad. They were not going to be allowed on the compound at first. It took 3 days of negotiations for them to even be allowed on the compound in the first place. That's not usually a good sign.
Yeah.
And before those negotiations come to an end, Jim Jones is already fomenting paranoia among the members. He's saying that they're going to invade. He says no one enters our compound without our approval. He tells them they're going to be taken away as prisoners. And this is the kind of stuff that he's been fueling for probably years at this point, because it's been 4 years since they founded Jonestown. He also prophesied that the congressman was never going to make it to them. The plane was going to fall out of the sky. So there was probably a big threat when he failed those negotiations and the congressman showed up. I feel like that probably led to a lot of the shitty feelings that he was having that led him to do what he did. So yeah, and Grace is there because she's trying to visit her son and get her son was left there with his dad. And
yeah. So you mentioned that Grace didn't go to Guyana, but so basically her husband must have stayed and took the son with him to Guyana, right? That's how it was. Because I was a bit confused about that, because there's a note where she's talking. I'm like, why isn't she mentioning her son? Because her son was very prominent in the previous one that we watched, where they were very much making a big deal about the custody of that. So yeah, I actually didn't pick up on the fact that Grace didn't go to Guyana. I thought that she had kind of escaped out of there, but it makes far more sense that she didn't go down.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting, and another reason why it's good that we did 3 different documentaries. I kind of wish we had done a different one than the first one we did, but
yeah,
it's such a huge story. There's so many moving parts. There's so many important pieces to it that I don't think there's one source that gets it all.
Yeah.
Again, my personal opinion, I think Jeff Gwynne gets as close as you can in his book, but that's a book. It's thousands of pages long, over 1,000 pages long. Sorry. It's not, you couldn't do a documentary that included all of that information without it being a total slog. Yeah. And, this was hard to watch, but it wasn't hard to watch because it was boring. It was hard to watch because they really got to the heart of this being an just unimaginable tragedy. And that's what it was, and it hit popular culture in a way that.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I also say, this documentary does a very good job of it's going to sound kind of grotesque in a way, but I mean it in a good way of how a good documentary should be done. They set the mood very well. The music is right. The music really sets the tone for where things are at each section of this. Like you you feel the dread building. No, and we all know what happens. It's just you're still paying attention. You're very much into what they're talking about because they're, like you said, they're talking to survivors or people who are in the church and left, or you get to hear the recordings. The recordings are they're rough.
I've heard a lot of people say if you have the opportunity to listen to them, don't. We didn't get a lot from the actual massacre, but what we got was enough. I really think, yeah.
Agreed. So, yeah. So it's interesting just the way they approach this, and they very much take it the day of, and having like several different reporters. They have a few cameramen, and just hearing all their views as they're coming in, and they're making their way, and they land there and they don't even know that they can get into this compound, which I think is fascinating, to fly to a whole other country in the 70s and get there and be like, hey, we're here, let's come see your thing. And then just waiting on them to be like, okay, is like, I don't know. That feels like you wouldn't do that today.
I'm actually really grateful for that perspective, though, because there is a lot in my experience. So I think, let me back up a little bit. There isn't anybody that doesn't know something about Jonestown, and the thing they know might not actually be like accurate, but they know something, right? And some of the background noise is hard to separate from what was actually reported, which wasn't always accurate, what was in documentaries, whatever, right? And so some of the background noise that I've had, I couldn't point you to a direct source, was that he was like cool with it at first, but that's not the reality. The reality is he did everything in his power to keep them off. And then when he couldn't anymore, he tried to put on this big happy family show for them. And I think that's really important, because if you understand his paranoia and his need to control the populace there, the fact that Leo Ryan and the news crew even got on to Jonestown might have been enough. We can look at all these other things that happened and know that with every single one of those things happening, that the person Jones was and the situation the way it was, yeah, checking off the list. But I actually think it might have been a done deal when he couldn't keep the congressman off the property.
Yeah, and that whole thing with the party thing, where basically it was a performance. Right. They were trying to show just how great everything was. And what I found really interesting was when they invited Leo Ryan to come up and talk. And he was just like, well, so far, this seems like a pretty happy place. And then the whole place just kind of erupts into this overwhelming applause.
It was so intense. And that's when Charles Kraft said, that's when we knew something wasn't right. And it's like, right? That is such a weird reaction. It's like their team won the World Series is what it sounded like.
Yeah.
Like people going nuts.
Yeah. And like the applause was like Cannes level standing ovation applause kind of deal. Like,
yeah. All it said was like, some people say this is the best thing that ever happened to him. And they just.
Yeah. And he's trying to talk and he can't because it's too loud.
Yeah.
And it's like, that would make me uncomfortable if it was that loud. Like, you have a boisterous thing, so people are enthusiastic, sure, but like to have it just continue to go on, that even in what little we saw, made it feel very sort of steep.
Oh yeah.
So yeah.
And so someone, okay, I want to preface like the whole rest of this episode by saying, going into this documentary, I had a chip on my shoulder for how the press deals with tragedy. I've had tragedies in my life, and unfortunately, a lot of them really close together in my hometown. And so I've experienced firsthand like the vulture kind of weirdness where they don't seem to care who they're stepping on or what, like how their presence is affecting people. I just really don't like it. I went in with zero respect for how the press deals with tragedy and somehow left with like even less
Mm-hmm.
So I have a big bias. I'll fully own that. Doug, if you disagree with me, please do so openly if I'm bringing my confirmation bias into this. Okay. And I said all that.
Yep.
Someone passes Congressman Ryan a note that says they want to leave.
No,
Tom,
they pass it to the reporter, Jones.
Sorry, the reporter, yeah.
Yeah, but it's part of the group, so yeah, somebody's
Right.
getting notes.
And so Tom sees this and he tells his dad, and his dad's like, go get your mom. He's like, this is going to be a problem. Here's where I get angry. Was it Don Harris who?
Don Harris.
He died.
Harris,
so I'll be careful here, but he wanted the story about how Jim Jones would react to finding out that a note was passed after this big show was put on. So he confronted Jim Jones with the note before any plans were made to remove anybody from the situation. And I have a big fucking problem with that decision.
Yeah, we're going to talk about another reporter who kind of, I think, makes an ill-conceived decision to go back into the fray. But
there's two more that I have some criticism about, but we'll get there.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean like later in the story. But yeah, just the idea of like, I'm going to get this story, and he kind of put that above how serious this is. If people already feel like the congressman who's here to find out if people are being held against their will, they cannot say to that congressman that they want to leave. You now know that these people are being held against their will and that there are consequences if they try to leave. You don't know what the consequences are necessarily, but you know they are there. And the choice that you make is, I'm going to get the story. Right. And a lot of people talked about, you see footage from that interview, and you see Jim Jones getting flustered, and you see people who knew him talking about how they could see kind of the wheels turning and how bad it was going to be once that note was revealed to him. And like I said, I have a big problem with that. I think if you are a journalist, you may feel like the story is more important than anything, but you have to ask yourself why the story is important.
Yeah,
and
people.
Right. And you could have at least waited till there was a plan. That's my opinion.
Yeah,
I really don't like it. I'm trying to be very careful because he did lose his life in this situation. I don't want to just like speak ill of somebody who never had a chance to even say if they regretted their actions. But to me, that was like unequivocally just terrible decision making.
Yeah. Do you think that they told Leo Ryan about this? Do you think he knew
that Don Harris was going to interview Jim Jones?
No, that they got notes. I would, because if he was the guy there, I would have thought that, like, as a congressman, he would maybe have been able, if he would have known that, would be able to kind of put the brakes on that a bit. Now, would the reporter have listened? Probably not.
We don't actually know, do we? Like, we don't know when he found out about this. We just know that he eventually did, because he was bringing the people who wanted to leave out and actually had to arrange for a second plane because so many people wanted out, right? But yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that because I just really got very angry in the moment of just like, what the fuck, dude? Like, there are bigger concerns here right now. And, like I said, I think for all intents and purposes, the moment that the congressman and the news crews got into Jonestown, the dominoes were starting to fall. But I don't know that to be true. We'll never know that to be true. Yep. We do know that as soon as Jim Jones knew that people were actively wanting to leave, he was going to be exposed because Congressman Ryan was going to go back to the U.S. He was going to tell people what he saw. He was going to tell people, look at all these people who are being held against their will, American citizens that I brought out. There's going to probably be an investigation. He knew all of that. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, you don't have to know that he was talking to his members about revolutionary suicide. You don't have to know. You know that he has enough power to keep people there against their will. That's really all you need to know that maybe you don't out the people wanting to escape before you've ensured that they can escape.
Yeah. And like the only reason I pointed that out is if Leo Ryan did know and didn't be like, "Hey man, pump the brakes there until we get these people out," then that's on Ryan as well.
Yeah.
Now he died as well, so like you don't want to speak ill of someone, but like as a
The other
congressperson,
decision Don Harris made that really kind of pisses me off is as they're trying to get these people out, they're loading who will fit onto the first plane, and the congressman is going to stay behind and wait for a second plane and fill that plane full of people who want to leave.
yeah.
And somebody tried to murder him with a knife in that moment. And when he returned to the airstrip, he was covered in blood, and they only found out after the fact that it wasn't his. Yeah. It was in the scuffle, the guy who was trying to kill him cut himself. Crazy shit. Don Harris again is like, gotta get the story, and wants to interview Congressman Ryan about almost being stabbed to death. And it's like, well, one, he give him a second to catch his breath, but two, we're in the middle of a fucking escape. And now it is perfectly clear how serious it is. Someone just tried to kill a U.S. congressman. Shit is getting real. Let him do his job and get these people out of there. You can talk to him on the fucking plane, you know?
Yeah, that was something where it was just very poor timing. Like, again, this is the thing. We've heard a lot of things where people are talking about like with reporters can be a bit. I've heard the word bloodthirsty. I don't think that's the right term, but it's something in that vein, like the whole "if it bleeds, it leads" and all that sort of shit. But this is like an early version of that. Like there was no controversy, and we see later when the reporters do get into Jonestown when they let everybody in after the armed forces have been there to clean up, and the first thing says, "Where was Jim Jones and where's all the tables?" It's like they didn't. That was their focus, was to get the story on that.
I'll say this. I have friends who are journalists and I adore them. And I think they are good at what they do. And, I've spoken with them, one-on-one, and I know that they care about the people when they report on crime and tragedy. I know that I'm not trying to say I feel this way about all journalists, but in my experience, I think that bloodthirsty can be a very accurate term. My experience with the press in these like swarming tragedies, I was a teenager and some of it happened on school grounds. Like it was that bad. You have kids who are reeling from a set of massive tragedies that took like members of their school, took their lives in very traumatic ways. It was more than one. And you had reporters on the school grounds cornering kids as they came out of grief counseling, like children. And so I'm not as hesitant as you are to say bloodthirsty, just for the record. That's where I'm coming from seeing this. It's like, I wasn't surprised, but I was angry.
Yeah. Like I said, it was, it just feels almost like you want to take the story and it feels like, well, this is my chance to get as a Pulitzer or whatever you get for journalism. I think it's a Pulitzer, but
yeah.
So it's crummy to watch like that kind of stuff. And like, I hadn't even considered, because of the way the documentary is filmed, like, oh, they're trying to get people out and this guy's like, poking the hornet's nest of Jim Jones. I didn't even think of that. And I think that's kind of a tribute to the this docuseries itself, was like not thinking of that. But and while I don't have your experience with the people experiencing tragedy and then these reporters coming in to a point where the vulnerable people are leaving something and just like coming up to them and trying to be at them about something, like I don't have that experience. But if I had that experience, I would probably have the same bias you. Right? Even now, I have a little bit of. I hold a little bit of disdain for that sort of pursuit. It feels like ambulance chasing for lawyers in that respect. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I'll try to have some empathy. You're in that situation. You went into it believing that it's not that bad. And now it's like things are happening. Maybe you're not sitting and thinking it all through. Maybe you're in work mode. whatever. That intention is not nearly as important as impact. And that, yeah, it was bad. And this is how insane this was going, right? Before the stabbing, people were so desperate to leave. They're like mobbing. Once, this is possible. We could get on a plane and leave. People are like coming out of the woodwork, was what somebody said. It was footage of Congressman Ryan saying people were coming out of the woodwork. And one of the, it must have been Charles Kraus, I think, said there was a couple, one wanted to leave and one wanted to stay, and they were like hurting their child, fighting over the child.
Each had an arm and like tug of war kind of thing with their kid.
And yeah, I think the people who wanted to leave had probably come to terms with the fact that Jones was abusive and capable of really horrible things, whereas a lot of the people who stayed were surprised by that, is what it seemed like. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy, knowing that they like did drills of drinking poison and stuff, but here's the thing: they drank the poison and that was it. Nothing bad happened.
Yeah. And
so the idea like that this time something bad is going to happen, probably not, right? And so there's a lot of that, and I think, cognitive dissonance will get you every time, but if you live there and you don't feel like you can leave, you're going to tell yourself a lot of lies just to get up in the morning and get through the day.
Sure. And it's one of those things where it's hard to explain to people, like if you've been in let's say an abusive situation, and you're in an abusive situation, there is a survival mode where you are just trying to get through it. I've been in scenarios like that where like I look back, I'm like, what was I doing? Well, I was surviving. I was trying to get through this particular instance the best way I could. And these people were stuck in a jungle in a country they weren't from.
Without money or passports.
Because he took their passports when they came in. You're right. He said, give me your passports. What can you do? Like, you just try to, all right, well, I'm just here. I might as well just try to fucking power through this and figure out how to get through. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would compare it in a way, I think, like, so, I went to Marine Corps boot camp. It's 3 months long. They do everything they can to throw you off, right? Like, we don't use this real names for anything. They're all new made up names. Like, everything to keep you confused. You don't know what time of day it is. You don't know anything. And it's done that way on purpose because, if you go into a combat situation, like, it's going to be fucking confusing, right? But when everything is confusing, it's like basically a foreign language is being thrown at you and you're disoriented all the time. It's the same thing. Like, you just get up and you go and you do what you have to do. I was so in that mode that you're talking about, survival mode, that I finished boot camp with a broken pelvis, including the big final hike, because I was like, I'm in a lot of pain. Anyway, because that's just kind of how it is when you're in a very upsetting, confusing, brutal situation. And you have to remember that when Jim Jones wasn't on the loudspeaker preaching at them, a tape of him was on the loudspeaker preaching at them. Mm-hmm. They were working hard labor day in and day out. They were exhausted. When people didn't do what he wanted them to do, they were publicly berated. There were reports that people were being locked in rooms and put on drugs for days and weeks at a time. You are going to just put your blinders on and put one foot in front of the other. And if you cannot empathize with that, you really can't understand how that happens. Oh God, I feel like I envy a person who can't understand that, right? Because I feel like everybody I know has at least had a week like that, if they haven't had a longer period of time like that.
Yeah. Sorry. It is when you are in the middle of it, Another way to think about it, if you're not even in an environment where you are in a cult, if you have multiple little children, you are in a cycle of lack of sleep, demands. You just have to really power through it. Now, this is not having kids not akin to a cult. I'm just trying to draw a relational point here. I remember my kids being very small and just being fucking exhausted all the time because I had to work a full-time job. I was also on call all the time. So I was working like 60-hour weeks, and I was the one that had to get up with the kids in the middle of the night because my ex-wife was a nurse. So like I was the one like just exhausted. I was a zombie for like 2.5 years. Like
Yeah.
you just like people, well, how do you do that? You just fucking do it. You're just like, I got to do it. Like the idea of taking a walk with a broken pelvis sounds like, how the fuck do you do that? But like you were in a mindset where you're like, I just have to get through this somehow. And
Right.
I can power you through that shit.
And maybe again, it feels very weird to compare boot camp to Jonestown. I'm not trying to at all insinuate that they are similar, but the thought process I think could be a little bit similar, which is like, well, if there's a part of you in the back of your mind that's like, well, if I go to medical and it turns out that this is really bad, my situation gets worse.
Mm. So
let's just pretend that it's fine. And that means that at least things won't get worse. And of course they did. I'm disabled as a result. But the thought for me of like getting held back and having to do these things over again, not getting to go on my 10-day leave, like that was just like, I let my leg fucking fall off.
Yeah. Now, I will say that my dad was in the Marine Corps, in the boot camp. He did one of these things and he fell and he broke his arm. Like you held it up and it was like just down. It was like an L on his arm. And but so he kind of didn't have a choice there. Like it was like yours, unfortunately, was sort of hidden because it was internal, and that sucks. But like this is a tangent of my dad was like had to go and had to get it set, but he still did boot camp with the cast on.
Yeah, I don't think they let you do that anymore, but I could be wrong.
This was the 60s, so
but also, here's the thing: is like you get like anything, more and more human rights every year. So your dad was probably, his experience was probably unimaginable to me, and some recruit getting hurt in boot camp today would hear my story and be like, fucking what? So anyway, the point being, survival mode is powerful, and it's for a reason. It's to survive in situations that seem insurmountable or unsurvivable, and our brains will go to great lengths to protect us. You know, you hear about people who literally have no memory of an extremely traumatic event because their brain just went, we don't need that.
They put it in a box and stuffed it in a little corner and said, I'm not going over in that corner anymore.
Yeah. So I think it's important to remember that when they got there, everything seemed great. And by the time they realized they couldn't leave, things were probably so bad that the idea of leaving seemed impossible anyway.
Yeah, the amount of people we saw in this documentary just basically accepting that they were going to die at that compound, just like, well, I'm just going to die here. That's what's going to happen. Like there was a resignation to it.
Yeah, and even, I mean, this is like the Congressman Ryan's assistant, Jackie Spire. Mm-hmm. She's in that situation for a couple fucking days. But when it came down to the wire, people around her are being shot. She has been shot. That resignation kicked in pretty much right away. And she survived.
Yeah.
Right? So, you think about this. It's like, well, what if this threat was looming over you every single day? Mm-hmm. If you can come to that resignation like that in the situation on the airstrip, imagine day after day after day for years what that could do to your brain.
Yeah. It's and we saw like a lot, like there was I think everybody had talked about Samsung, who was a photographer for NBC, I believe. He got shot. So did Charles Kraus. So did Reiterman. He was another guy.
I liked Samsung a lot. He was
a
bright spot in the documentary. He's the kind of guy you'd really like to hang out with, I feel like.
Yeah. But all of them just had a point where they were just like, oh, okay, well, I guess this is how it ends. Like on a fucking airfield in the middle of Guyana, like away from all your loved ones and all that shit. That had to be super depressing.
Yeah. So we're kind of sort of into episode 2 now. We took the length of episode 1 to talk about episode 1. But basically
a lot of shit happens. So.
Yeah, and it does. And so basically, someone tries to kill a congressman. Shit gets crazy after that, which should come as no surprise to anyone. And they're talking about basically waiting to see what the fuck is going to happen. And I remember when Tom said, massive relief washed over me because we were leaving. Then Jim Jones wanted to talk to my mom. And that being like, you just kind of knew, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be fucking bad. Mm-hmm. And what's crazy about that story is we don't actually really get what happened. We see video of it, of him talking to her. But what happened to Tom is so insane. We don't actually ever hear what exactly happened to his parents. We have to assume they were shot in the attack on the airstrip because they were with him. But there's so many moving parts, and his story is so crazy that after the shooting starts, it's like, who fucking knows what happened?
Yeah, there's one part where I guess he said he took his sisters, plural, into the jungle.
We had him until that point, yeah.
And so, but he didn't mention anything about his parents.
He said, my father told me if anything happens, grab my sisters and run into the jungle. So that's what I did. And here's the mind-blowing part of the story. He was already pretty far into the jungle before he realized that he had been shot and his leg was mangled. I think he said half my leg was gone. Yeah. I think is what he said. He was running and didn't know. That's how much chaos and adrenaline and confusion was going on. Is his brain just went to, I'm going to do what my dad said. And I'm going to get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, there's one thing Jackie Spire said that I thought was, unfortunately, not prophetic. It's the exact opposite. When they got out to Jonestown, they got to the airfield. She could feel like she was taking like verbal affidavits from people that they wanted to leave while she was there. She was an attorney,
right?
And talk about doing that in the middle of Jonestown, where you are in enemy territory, and she just like, I'm going to get all these affidavits.
Yeah, I'm going to make
these people. It's all legal. Nobody's being coerced. Blah blah blah. Like, but they got out and they were heading to the airfield. She made the comment, "My God, we got out of there in just the nick of time." No, you didn't. Well, you got out of there in the nick of time, but you did not get out of everything in the nick of time.
So basically, we're talking around it. We're getting kind of everywhere with this. There's like a little bit of an assumption that people know what happened, but I think seeing it in the documentary the way it was, I have a better understanding of what happened for sure. Yeah. So Leo Ryan, the camera crews, and the people who wanted to leave Jonestown are on the airstrip. They're loading one of the planes. They're making a plan for what's going to happen when the second plane comes. And that is when a tractor, of all things, full of armed men arrive and open.
It's pulling a trailer behind it. Let's make it clear. It wasn't just a tractor of like 20 guys hanging off.
Yeah, there's like a shitload of gunmen, and they just open fire. People inside the plane are being hit. People outside the plane are being hit. Bodies are dropping. Pure chaos. Then these guys get out of the vehicle and they start pretty much just ensuring that everybody is actually dead. And we hear from Charlie Krause and Jackie Spire, like, oh, they're going to shoot us again. And was it Charlie Krause that said he played dead?
No, it was Samsung.
Samsung, right.
Yeah, he lay down and just acted like he was dead. So, yeah. But
and
they also thought that they heard 3 consecutive shots and then nothing. And they thought it was because they were trying to make sure that Leo Ryan was dead.
Right. Which that could be it. It could be that they were going to, we just don't know. They don't know. They were left there. They drugged themselves into the jungle as well after the gunmen left. they watched the plane fly away because the pilot said, fuck this. Which, two perspectives here, right? You're the pilot. You don't know what the fuck is going on. There's guns. I understand getting the fuck out of there. But if you're the person bleeding in the jungle, I understand cursing that pilot and everyone, like his entire family line, right? I understand both sides there.
Yeah. As you can see, both, like you said, both perspectives make a lot of sense in that thing. Like, yeah, it's fight or flight kind of deal. And he literally took flight. So that pilot.
Yeah.
But they did say something where I think after the gunman left and they thought it was okay, they basically took like the seriously wounded to a tent at the end of the airfield.
Yeah,
like,
and then
why the fuck are you putting them at the end of the airfield? Like, get them away from the airfield. That's where all the shit happened.
Yeah, well, but then they ended up in a rum house.
Yeah, which, hey, if you're gonna go anywhere, that's a good place to go, I guess.
And that was one of the bright points again to Samsung talking about, like he was trying to disinfect his wounds with the rum. They're like, no.
Just don't do that. Just drink. And he said he got drunk and he fell asleep. And I'm like, okay, well, that's
yeah. There's nothing better that you could be doing in that moment. So yeah, everybody on the airstrip is wounded. They're dead. They're confused. There are people from Jonestown that were going to leave, hiding in the desert, in the jungle. There are people from Jonestown that didn't intend to leave until shit got real, hiding in the desert. The desert, what the hell? The jungle. And we hear this story, and this is amazing to me. There's a woman in a group, not on her own, with her son strapped to her back and some other, I think, mothers and their kids that were just executing a planned escape that had nothing to do with any of this. They're in the jungle.
Yeah, they were trying. They said their plan was to walk 30 miles to get to Georgetown. And
they believed that they would be shot if they were found. And she told her group, if anything happens to me, if I get shot, if I go down, leave me there and take my son. Mm-hmm. So this is knowledge that a lot of people had that were at Jonestown, that shit was going to go wrong. And I got to say, I think that if you have a situation where there's a group of people willing to take those risks and plan an escape and actually be in the middle of it, there were plenty more who were in some stage of planning an escape. There's no way it was just this group of like 10 people. My opinion, and we also know that a lot of the dead at Jonestown did not take the poison voluntarily. Yeah. So there's that. And I just think it's important because my big pet peeve is that the Jonestown massacre was a massacre. It wasn't a mass suicide.
Yeah, it was mass murder. Yeah.
That's my hill to die on. I really, from what we know, we just know that it's not true, that it was purely a mass suicide. And even the people who took it willingly, are you taking it willingly if someone's got a crossbow pointed at you? Like, I don't know. It just, whatever. So that's what's happening on the airstrip. And back at Jonestown, Jim Jones gets on the PA system and says, everybody come to the pavilion. And I think, there's a general sense at that time, like, this ain't going to be good.
Yeah. And also, before we go, just let's reiterate that they did a bunch of practice sessions before this.
Yeah.
And they called it the White Night. Like, not night as in nighttime, but like night of, a white knight coming to save you. Like,
yeah, Jones really presented it to them in the practice sessions and on the day of, as this is not suicide. This is a revolutionary statement, and this saves you. Mm-hmm. Because what they're going to do to you if they get you is going to be so much worse. He tells them they're going to torture their children, which, like, fucking what? But he had so much control over them. You have to remember, there was pretty much not a time where his voice was not in these people's ears, whether it was a recording or his actual voice.
Right.
24 hours a day. first of all, that's a torture tactic. That's literally a torture tactic.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows what effect that had on people. But they had done these practice runs, and the practice runs always had a sedative in them, and it was like, oh yeah, like they were also told it was going to be painless. And I think that, I mean, cyanide poisoning is not painless. I'll say that. No. That's where I'll stop on that one for now. But yeah, everyone is saying he looks manic, he's disheveled, he's paranoid, he's talking crazy. And I think that's like the people, the populace, start to understand like this is not going to be good.
Yeah, there is one part too that there's a statement that Jones makes where there's a guy named Tim Carter who is introduced, and Tim Carter's story is that fucking hard. That's a heartbreaking one.
Yeah,
we'll get to him. But when everything left and the people were chaotic and everything was kind of up and everything, like the congressman, everybody left. Jones says, "I've never heard Jonestown so peaceful." And just like this sort of very cold, just like, and that Carter guy was like, I knew shit was going to go down at that point. Like, what a comment to make. I've never, and this was before he sent the gunman, right? Well, he sent the gunman, but
yeah, in the documentary, it's kind of going back and forth between what's happening at Jonestown and what's happening on the airstrip. So in the documentary, I think we knew that they'd been shot, but we weren't getting anything else. One thing I do want to quote what Stefan said about his dad, because I think this is really important. And I think if you read the Jeff Gwynne book, you know this to be true. If you don't, it's a lot harder to grasp. He says, I'm going to read it the way that he said it, but he was I'm going to maybe edit it. I'm going to paraphrase a tiny bit because he was starting and stopping thoughts and it's a little bit confusing. Yeah. People talk about Jim Jones as a good man who got lost in power and drugs and whatever. And, like he became sick later on. But I had a very different perspective on my father, and I saw behind the curtain. A lot of my father's craziness was well hidden for years, and he was as nuts as anybody gets. And then he also said he was constantly trying to feel better about himself. And he said that's not solely in reference to the drug use. That is in the way that he controlled people, in the way that he ran the church, just in the way that he existed, was to feel better about himself. And in order to feel better about himself, he had to be the center of everything. And I remember also, I think this is an interesting thing, that Stefan, like the straw that broke the camel's back for him was when his dad introduced him to his mistress. And he thought, I'm not going to tell my mom because this will break her heart. And then he found out his mom already knew. And he started to understand how fucked up Jim Jones was being to Marianne. I forgot her name.
I forget her name too. But in the first documentary we watched, which was shitty, they did talk about how Jones had multiple mistresses and kind of just made them, like, introduce them to his kids and everybody. And it was just like, so Stefan's saying that kind of tracks with that bit. It's actually something that feels like, hey, they didn't kind of embellish that in the first one. So.
I also want to point out that while this was going on, they talk about this in the documentary, while this was going on, Stefan was in Georgetown with the traveling basketball team. And so some of the deaths were voluntary suicide. What they don't talk about in this documentary is what he went through, which is that two of the adults that were chaperoning that trip were trying to kill themselves. And he spent the whole night trying to prevent them from killing themselves. And if I remember correctly, both of them succeeded in the end, if not both, one of them.
Okay, man. And
this is happening while he knows that his mom is back at Jonestown also.
Yeah.
So his trauma to me is just like unimaginable.
Yeah.
He was a teenager. And then he was apprehended and held as a criminal. So
and to your point too, is like there's some other things we need to get to, but we're kind of jumping around timeline a smidge because that's how this documentary kind of was. But there's a part where after he's apprehended, he holds a press conference, and Charles Kraus is like asking him very pointed questions, like just this kid is clearly like deer in the headlights, like what the fuck is going like.
Well, here's what I'll say too is I don't think that was a voluntary press conference either.
No, I don't think so either.
It did not appear so, and he didn't know if his family had survived. He had brothers and sisters and his mother there. He didn't know yet.
Yeah,
nobody knew yet.
But this is the part where you talked about reporters being a little, what's the word? Morally ambiguous.
Yeah, and I get this particular situation. I hate it because we know so many years have passed. Stefan Jones has talked a lot about his beliefs about his father, but at the time nobody knew that, and I sort of understand that drive of like, you're his son, you were going to be the one that took it all over, you had to be in on it. That anger coming after being shot and watching your friends die and knowing that all of these other people had died, I can kind of empathize with that, even though, you know, you hope that a grown-ass adult will stop and take a deep breath and not berate a teenager for the sake of a story. That's what you hope, but that's really not how people work. When they interviewed the woman who had been executing her escape with her son, unaware any of this was happening, a different reporter said, if you were there, would you have taken the poison? And she said, no. So would you have given your son the poison? She said, no. Yeah, you would. Yes, you would have. And he was yelling at her. And yes, you would have. You would have done it. Da, 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 da. And I just was like...
Didn't help that woman was a black woman either. So
sure didn't.
Because I'm sure that was part of that whole equation as well. So,
but a lot of people talked about leaving felt bad because they had survivor's guilt, which is 100% understandable. Mm-hmm. Then you have reporters saying, well, why did you leave? You could have saved somebody if you stayed. It's like, fucking what? How?
Yeah. Like there's a thing where Stefan talks about how guilty he felt that he wasn't there, so he could have stopped it. And I was like, you couldn't have stopped that. And let's say you stopped it that day. Guess what?
Next day.
That would have happened eventually. That would have happened eventually. Yes, there were some very key and things that happened to kind of fulcrum it into this awfulness that happened. But Jones was cracking all over the place, and eventually this would have happened.
Well, I don't think that Stefan had any level of influence that would have even made that remotely possible. So time traveling back again now.
Yeah.
They're in the pavilion. There's a big old vat of cyanide-laced drink, because it wasn't Kool-Aid, for the record. And we hear the tapes. He's telling them it's time for the revolutionary suicide. You can hear people arguing with him from the crowd. There is a tape of a woman clearly right next to him, given how good the audio is, arguing with him about it. For whatever reason, Tim Carter is called aside and given a suitcase full of cash and told to take it to the Russian embassy because Jim Jones wanted his final middle finger to the U.S. to be that all the money that was left went to the Soviet Union. His story's a little bit... The documentary didn't fully connect it point to point.
Yeah.
So obviously he's going to go do this. He's supposed to come back when he's done. People start drinking it. Now, I've said this before because I think it's really important because it gives you if you sit with this information, it will give you an ounce of understanding as to why the people who did it voluntarily may have done it voluntarily. remember, he told them it would be painless.
Mm-hmm.
He gave the poison to the children first. Cyanide poisoning is not painless. It is a really fucking horrible way to die. So as the children drink this stuff and the parents see, this is not painless. I don't know what that does to a person. One, they may not have believed that anything bad was going to happen anyway because they had been doing these drills and nothing bad had happened up till then. And two, it's not fucking painless. And three, like, it's real now, and whatever you were thinking up to the moment you did it, you can't undo it now. There's no saving your child at that point. Right. And if you're not a parent and you're just watching it happen, I don't know what that does to you. I just don't know. Yeah. Unfortunately, we know what it did to Tim Carter, because as he was leaving to take this money, he saw his wife holding his dying child, and he stayed with her as she died. Mm. And it seems like he ended up with a fairly good life after Jonestown. It does not seem like those experiences have ever been very far from the front of his mind. That's my opinion watching him speak on it.
Yeah, and he was very emotional, as one would be. But, well, not everybody, because some people would bottle that shit up and just fucking try not to let it out. But, like, he cried a few times, and, like, I would too. Like, that poor guy, like, went to the ringer, and basically he couldn't be there to, and it makes you wonder, like, if he didn't have this task and was kind of sent to do this task, would he have been like, fuck this, I'm going to stay with my wife and kids?
That's what I fucking mean too, right? Like, okay, so, this all starts and you're like, well, I don't want to kill myself. And then you watch your wife poison your son and poison herself, and you watch them die in agony. I don't know. People lost their, spouse and child under circumstances that they didn't have to view physically with their own eyes, have wanted to kill themselves. Sure. And, if you're there and it's being, it's happening in front of you, and the poison is right there, maybe you just take it. But what we understand is that not everybody did just take it. And again, this comes back to my issue with the fucking press. Because in the final episode, it's a lot from the perspective of the people who did the recovery mission, which were U.S. Army soldiers. And the soldier that's speaking, he makes no bones about it. He said you could tell immediately there were people who were held down and force fed. There were people who were injected in the back of the neck. Mm-hmm. There were plenty of people were flat out murdered, no question about it. They did not want to take the poison, and they were either force-fed it or stabbed in the back of the neck with a syringe. That is not counting the people who did it because there was a crossbow or a gun pointed at them, which was also happening. That is not counting the people who were being berated into submission by Jim Jones himself, which we heard tape of happening.
Yeah. Him telling people to quiet their kids, and like, it's quiet, die with dignity. Like, just like he was telling them they were going to die.
My mother's keening in grief and pain because their children are dying in their arms. And he's telling them basically, shut the fuck up and just die.
Yeah. So that guy, his name was not Netterville. Sorry. I did have it written down somewhere. But it was basically, this guy was talking about how it was just like he was a spec ops guy. He was a guy who'd special ops. Like, he's drawn blood and seen it and been there, done that stuff. And him coming into this thing, which was, his name was Netterville. That's what it was. And there's some really interesting things that happened that are super chilling, that on the surface don't sound super chilling. Like when they're flying in and Netterville says it looks like a bunch of clothes laying all over the place. And then another guy, the Krause, the one reporter said, oh, it looks like confetti. Like as they were higher up coming in, and it's just bodies, just fucking bodies, every fucking place, everywhere.
This is another example, I think, where this documentary really goes above and beyond, I guess is the best way to say it. Because obviously you watch the documentary, you know what happened. You know how it ends. But I felt like we really had an opportunity to experience it. Like, what if you didn't know what you were going into? You were Netterville or Krause, and you're seeing this, and you're like, what is that? And then literally it's coming into focus as you land. And you've got to get out of that helicopter, and like the enormity of it. The other thing I would say, the thing that really stuck with me in a really like chilling, horrible way is they kept cutting to tape of reporters in the US updating the death toll. Mm-hmm. And the reason that they didn't know that they kept getting it wrong is because they kept finding another layer of people under the people that they were counting.
Yeah.
And I think it was Netterville that talked about, you're looking at all these coffins, casket things that are built to transport the bodies. And then you turn around and it just keeps going. Mm-hmm. Like I said, it was about half a 9/11.
Yeah. Because initially their report was 450 people dead. And they thought there might be up to 500 people who survived. And that wasn't the case because they kept like pulling bodies and finding children and small adults. And like literally it was just finding layers of people under dead bodies and
then the final count of going to clear the barracks and finding that there were more dead in the barracks.
Yeah, finding 30 and 40 here, 30 and 40 there. Like it was just nonstop of them finding bodies. One thing I wanted to ask you that I saw, and it's all right. So the images of the things and hearing Jones talking were two of the really hardest pieces of this for me.
Oh yeah.
And there's one shot they show, and there's bodies kind of blurred in the background, and it's a fence post with railings, and there's a stethoscope hanging over it.
Oh, I didn't catch that. I'm going to be honest with you, Doug. I normally watch these like every little detail, but by the end of that first episode, I had a game on my phone, like a mindless game, that I could kind of just a degree of separation so that I could get through it.
All right. So as someone who also appreciates horror movies and shows and books, there's something really unsettling about some very mundane thing.
Oh yeah.
In the middle of a murder scene. And the classic one is a shoe, like a kid's shoe or something very mundane. A stethoscope is a mundane thing, but more, it is something that is used to help people stay alive, to heal. And I just remember being like, fuck, like just, it's weird. Like, I don't know. Do you want to speak a bit on the idea of the mundanity of things making things worse? That was just something that struck me, and maybe I'm a little off.
No, I agree. It's like, I think that's what was really upsetting. No, that's one of the things.
One. There's plenty. There's plenty
things about what Netterfield had to say, right? Because like, no matter how big and bad and traumatic and unimaginable this was, it was also a day at work for him.
Yeah.
Like, and I actually just said this to my husband before we came in to start. I said, can you imagine that you go to work for a few days, maybe a work week, 5 days, in 1978, and in 2024 you can't talk about it without crying?
Yeah.
That's a really fucking bad day at work.
Yeah, there's a relative of mine who was in Vietnam, and his job was to harvest pieces and bodies to take back to the United States. That is a gruesome fucking job. And when he got back, he wasn't well, so he had to go and do things for get therapy, and so he had things put in place that basically were things to block a lot of that out. So he couldn't sleep.
Yeah.
I can't imagine. This has to feel like that has to be sort of in the same vein.
I think in many ways worse, right? Because it's all together. There's no separation. There's no day like okay, so this is a weird fact about me. One of the things I did in the Marine Corps is I worked at the schoolhouse that trained what at the time was called Mortuary Affairs Marines and Soldiers, which were those guys. That was their job. Now it's called something else. Personnel retrieval something.
Personnel retrieval? That sounds so clinical.
Yeah, but so here's the thing that's very interesting about it though, is I worked at the schoolhouse. I did a lot of weird jobs, but it's at the schoolhouse. It's a weird school, as you can imagine. I was not a mortuary affairs Marine. I was doing admin work. The stigma around doing that job was so bad that I got like bullied by some higher ups over it. People don't want to fucking think about it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to believe that that's a job that has to be done. And again, we're talking about the things that we do, that our brains do to let us wake up in the morning and go do whatever we have to do. In retrospect, I understand why that was happening at the time. I was like, man, fuck you. Right? So I also imagine, back before it was a real MOS, it's probably even worse to be the guy who got that job. And if you're the guy who did it at Jonestown, especially with all the misinformation, especially with the fact that people were so blasé about it and so crass, I don't want to fucking talk about it with you. I don't want to hear what you have to say about it. You weren't there. You don't know. And I feel like there's either, I don't want to talk to you because you're being an asshole, or you don't want to talk to me because you don't even want to think about the fact that that happened. And I don't feel like there's a whole lot of in between in interactions that the soldiers who did that job had with people who did not do that job.
Yeah. It is just
the other thing, sorry, I keep thinking I need to say this and forgetting. When they landed, they didn't know Jim Jones was dead.
No, they did not. They went in thinking he might be alive, which is
so they were actually, in addition to coming down and understanding, oh, that's not a pile of clothes, those are people. In addition to all of that, they were also afraid for their lives. They did find him pretty immediately, but if you think 450 people are still alive, are they all safe? So there's, I think, an undercurrent of fear in addition to the trauma of just dealing with this unthinkable tragedy of literally handling those bodies. And again, I don't mean to be like, I feel like I want to send this message home, and it maybe isn't kind, but maybe it's necessary. They were handling the bodies of children that had been buried under their parents and friends and loved ones. That is not anything. I cannot imagine it. I don't want to imagine it. It is not something I can empathize with because my brain can't get there to put myself in their shoes. And I think it's important to understand how bad it really was. Because in addition to the fact that those men went there and did that, and the reporters they had, I think, a handful of reporters who were allowed basically to get the video for the whole world. They weren't going to let a whole bunch of people.
It was a reporter and a camera person. They were allowed one of each.
Okay.
And one of them was Charles Krause, who had been shot.
And I understand his desire to do that. I understand, I want to know what this was all for, right?
Well, he didn't phrase it that way. He phrased it, the story wasn't done.
Which,
Okay, whatever, dude. Just if you want to understand it, that I get, but like,
I think though, there's things that our brains do, right? This is a story. This is about the story. It's like, yeah, but you're part of it now. Like you got shot. Like your friends are dead. Anyway.
we can also talk about the fact that those guys had to recover bodies in the middle of a Guianan jungle where everything is decomposing at an accelerated rate because it's the fucking jungle and it's super hot.
Right. And I want to again remind people of what I just said, given that new information about how absolutely horrific this must have been. And when you look at the death toll, this was one of the things, again, was maybe a little mundane, but really fucked me up. It was 153 men, 452 women, which makes sense because women tend to be like the churchgoers, right? 302 children and 2 unidentified.
I remember seeing that.
Unidentified, we're not getting a list of all of those names. We're getting male, female, child. And 2, we don't know.
Yeah.
That
they could identify even the gender of them. That's
bad.
Yeah. So, and I remember seeing that graphic, and per your instructions, I told Jill not to watch it, but she was doing something on her computer, and I stopped it, and I sent that graphic, and I said, "Look at that," and she was just like her eyes, like, "Oh my God!" I'm like, "Yeah."
I want to say something else about that stupid fucking documentary we watched last month. Like this just hit me right now, so excuse me. 452 women died, and the whole point of that fucking weird-ass documentary was actually it's the women who were the bad guys. More women than anybody else died. And I'm sure a significant number of those 302 children were also girls. Like, holy fuck.
Yeah.
Or this, like, hyper fucking Christian religion where the women were in charge. Come the fuck on. Anyway, yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So to this point, we also mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to get to this point with Spire, Jackie Spire, where, you know, she survived this, and she probably shouldn't have.
She says as much.
Yeah.
She says she has no idea why she's alive. She shouldn't have made it.
Yeah. So she said a comment where she said we failed the people at Jonestown, and I could not disagree with that more. And I think it's just because they wanted to think that they could go in and just change it and make the narrative different. And as a survivor, you want to think you could have affected a change so all those people didn't die. I get that. That guy was running that place, and he was going to kill all those people at some point.
I had similar feelings to you, but also kind of like, man, she's the only fucking person saying that, because there is a point at which that is true about, you know, the system in general.
Yeah.
This wasn't the first time that somebody had spoken to the U.S. government about what was happening down there. This is, I mean, part of the reason Jim Jones fucking accelerated the move to Guyana in the first place was that it was coming out that he was crazy and doing shit that, as we see in the beginning of the documentary, he's giving a sermon where he's like, I have the body of God. Some people have said that I'm God.
Yeah. How many times have we heard that in the show?
Yeah. Which, you know, Cult Podcast has a feature where they're like, and here's the Wikipedia list of people who claimed to be Jesus at that time.
He didn't claim to be Jesus. He just claimed to be God. So, like,
I admired her for saying it because I felt like some of the other people interviewed, not all of them, it was like, it was more of the same, right? That like, well, these were a bunch of fucking crazy cult fanatics who killed themselves, so whatever. Where she was kind of, I think she was at least acknowledging that there was a chance at some point for this not to happen. And their goal was to go and assess what was happening at Jonestown. And I think in a perfect world, maybe 2 years earlier even, they would have went back to the U.S. They would have been like, shit's fucked up over there. We need to do an investigation. We need to whatever the plan is and get these US citizens out of this situation. And I don't think I agree with you. I don't think it would have happened. I don't think that is realistic. Things had already gone pretty far off the rails by the time they got to Guyana. It's just that the people who went to Guyana didn't know that.
Yeah, they weren't aware. Well, Stefan even said that, he said he felt guilty that he couldn't be there to try to stop it. And, I think that's, like you said, that survivor's guilt. That's a very common and understandable way to think. Like, if I were in that scenario, I'd probably like to think that I could have said something or done something to help. Not in a hero perspective, but more like maybe I could have affected some change where maybe not so many people died, or like you could have done.
Yeah, maybe I could have gotten my mom into the jungle, right? Yeah. Or whatever it might be, or just the simple fact of I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to be one of the dead. Why am I not? What in the world happened that would leave me here? Well, over 900 people there died. Like I can't imagine trying to wrap your brain around that. I can't.
But so you were talking about that lady, Leslie Wilson, I think her name was, who carried her kid, who they just escaped at the right time.
Yeah.
Knowing that, I somehow managed to escape that just by good fortune and timing. And she was saying how they were walking up the hill. She's like, why is nobody shooting us? Like they fully expected to be shot and they weren't because they were preoccupied with this other thing. So her timing was great in that perspective. But there's something else she said that I thought was pretty interesting, was she had been in that thing since she was 13. So she was in there and all of her family, besides her and their son, died there.
Yeah.
And she talked about flying in to America, and they're flying in New York City. She could see all the lights, and she was just like, what do I do now? Like,
what do you fucking do? They were not given a good education.
Nope.
They have a family. They don't have any friends because all their friends also died.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things I can say for all the judgment that I see a lot of the time, like people who've been victims of cults get all of the stigma around all the judgment they get. It's like, okay, so you were in Sea Org from the time you were fucking born until you were 32 and you got out and you have managed to eat. You've managed to have a roof over your fucking head. You've managed to deal with your trauma enough to be able to sit in front of a camera and tell your fucking story. You have done things I literally cannot imagine having to do, could not possibly think of how to accomplish. You're a fucking badass. And I feel that way about, like, when I said like Tim Carter seems to have a pretty good life. I cannot comprehend the inner work a person has to do in order to have a good life after what he went through.
But that's a tribute to the resiliency of people, though, in certain ways, right? Like the idea of like you had this really super traumatic thing, and the idea that, so we should clarify, Tim Carter went on to have 3 more kids, and in the documentary he talked about how
he got married again, yeah,
and so he has a grandkid who has the same name as his son who was killed at Jonestown,
which is beautiful but also heartbreaking, Yeah. But here's the thing I would say, Doug, is like, and I can say this as a trauma survivor, as somebody who has PTSD and went untreated, undiagnosed, unmanaged for a fucking decade. If you don't handle your shit, you are not the kind of person who is capable of having a good life. You're not capable of having a successful long-term relationship. On any timeline, eventually that shit blows up because you're not dealing with your shit. And I only use myself as an object lesson here or whatever because I don't want to make it seem like I'm judging anybody who's been through trauma. It's just this idea of like, if you really genuinely hate yourself, you do destructive things, and you cannot keep that destruction from rippling out to the people in your circle which are going to be your wife, your kids, etc. If you're Tim Carter, if you're me, not necessarily. But yeah, so to me, the fact that he's still married to this woman, that he has children and grandchildren that he has a relationship with, that his child would name his grandchild after the son that was lost, that is a conversation that they had, right? A lot of people lose a child in much less tragic circumstances, much less traumatic circumstances. They won't let anybody talk about it around them. He had to do some hard fucking work. And again, that woman whose name I didn't write down that we keep talking about, who left.
Leslie Wilson.
Yes, thank you. Leslie Wilson. She said the stigma around just being a member of the People's Temple was so intense. She didn't talk to anybody.
And she changed her name.
Yes, she changed her name, and she just held that trauma inside of her. And this is a woman who sat with her preschool age son on her lap as reporters told her, you would have murdered your son if you were there, on television for the world to see. And she didn't have anybody to talk to. All I can say is I am amazed. No way that at some point in time she found a way to talk about it, found someone to talk about it, did whatever work she had to do so that she could sit there and tell that story. Because again, a lot of people, either because they don't have access to the right help or they just cannot figure out how to ask for it or go get it, would never get there. They'd never get. And the press briefing about Jonestown had jokes about drinking the Kool-Aid. The official press briefing, a goddamn general made jokes about drinking the Kool-Aid moments after this shit happened.
What he said specifically, and I wrote this down because I just couldn't believe he did it. There was a phone ringing in the middle of his press conference, and he said to
dip it in your vat of Kool-Aid.
He said, take that telephone out of its misery, stick it in a jar of Kool-Aid, and he laughed and smiled. And I'm like, could you be any more crass? Could you not have any empathy? Now, granted, I'm not going to say generals and these career military types are generally folks who have a fuck ton of empathy, but that was super duper.
You know, they have kids. And here's the other thing I'm going to say, because that got me on two levels. One, like, have you ever heard of too soon?
Yeah.
Because holy fucking shit. And also, for the record, it's 2024. That documentary came out this year. Mm-hmm. And Stefan Jones is saying, please stop making those jokes. Mm-hmm. Because those people, you know, and not everybody who was a member of the People's Temple was in Jonestown. So when we talk about survivors, there are a lot of survivors because they were up north, stateside for this. Mm-hmm. They lost their loved ones. They lost their friends. They lost their family. Like Stefan Jones, that was his fucking dad, man. They're alive. They are here. They hear the jokes. They hear the misinformation. They hear it being called a suicide, a mass suicide instead of a mass murder. So it got me on that level. And it also got me on this level. I think one of the most chilling experiences of my life. There's a podcast called The Dollop. I haven't listened to it in a while, but I remember listening to, I think it was the episode they did on Ronald Reagan. And they played. Well, wait, because it gets worse than just mentioning his name.
Always does with him, but go ahead.
Sure fucking does. They played audio of a press briefing about. Oh, I don't know what the press briefing was about. This is why it's important. Because a reporter raised their hand and said, what about the AIDS crisis? And they made a whole bunch of jokes about, why do you care? Are you gay? Blah, 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 blah. Ha, 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 ha. And you just hear the press secretary and the assorted members of the press, ha, 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 ha. Gay folks are fucking dying and we don't know why. Blah, 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 blah. And I really think it's important to remember that happened in 1978 over Jonestown. That happened in the 80s over AIDS. The only reason it's not happening right fucking now is because people in the fucking press corps and your press secretary and whatever else know that it's going to be viewed on TV because We see those things on the internet, on the TV, on everywhere, not just C-SPAN. That's the only fucking reason that your fucking government isn't laughing at you when you die. For the fucking record, just want to let you know. That's the only reason.
Yeah, well, the idea too is with anything with queer rights, the press secretary is a queer woman, so that actually helps in this modern context.
I mean, in a general sense of contemporary times, not literally. I'm not specifically saying that the current press secretary is a total horrible person, but that laughter was not an isolated incident.
Nope.
And, again, those were American citizens in Guyana.
Yep.
Their family members were here in the United States. Or I can dream that maybe we have viewers in other countries. I don't think we do. But here where I am in the United States, like, in doing that, they co-signed, they said, go right fucking ahead to the press to berate the survivors, to make jokes, to call it a mass suicide, to just impugn these people who were dead. They're there to speak for themselves. They're not there to say, no, I didn't drink it. I was stabbed in the back of the neck. No, I didn't want to, but I either drank the stuff or got shot. So I drank it. No, I wouldn't have done it, but I saw 15 kids die in front of me. And after that, it seemed like, why be alive after that?
Yeah.
They're there to say that. And we have this thing where a lot, and especially all these years removed, everything you know about Jonestown is kind of background noise unless you take the time to read a well-researched book or watch a well-done documentary, because God forbid the only thing you know about Jonestown is the documentary we watched last month. People don't fucking understand the enormity of it. They do not get. I don't blame anybody who doesn't want to watch that video, that film taken from the helicopter coming in on those piles of bodies. Mm-hmm. I will never blame anybody for not listening to the audio. After the snippets of the audio we heard in this documentary, I will never listen to the full audio ever, ever, ever. I don't want to. I'm going to protect myself in that way. I blame nobody for that. You do not have to get that close to this issue to understand that over 900 people died and 302 of them were children. Mm-hmm. They died in agony, and a vast majority probably wouldn't have died that day if they were given a real choice in the matter. It was a murder. It was a fucking tragedy, and these people were impugned. They were made fun of. They still are made fun of. People don't even think about the connection when they make jokes that relate back to Jonestown. And one thing I liked about this documentary is at the end, it said it was considered a mass suicide, but we now know it is a mass murder. Today, when I was looking at articles for Cult News, I saw an article that said, we don't know if it was a suicide or a murder. We kind of do, though. Because the fact of the matter is that if anybody was forcibly injected with cyanide, if anybody was held down and forced to drink, then everybody was under undue influence. Everybody knew that if they didn't drink it, they would be injected with cyanide or held down and had it poured down their throat. They knew that.
Yeah. So there's one thing I want to make a point of and ask your opinion on this, because this sort of bothered me. I get it. Let me just say, I understand why this was. Leslie Wilson talked about how on her journey to where she is, and this is her journey, and this is how she chose to do it, she had to forgive Jim Jones for her to move on. And I, in my brain, was like, absolutely fucking not. Now, I'm not her. I don't know her journey. That works for her. But where do you stand on that sort of stuff? I feel like that is a sort of, forgive me, a religious take on that. Like the idea of like, You have to like, and I will say that as I know I have some people in my family who are evangelical Christians who are big on you need to forgive so you can move on, even if it's something very heinous. And I think that's bullshit.
So before I want to say two things. Due to the same technical difficulties that meant that I could not stream this to my Facebook, I cannot see the comments and I cannot see whatever you put in the private chat.
I was saying I had a conversation point, and this is it.
Okay, this is it. Okay, good. I tried again, it still didn't work. I don't know what is going on with my StreamYard. I hate forgiveness culture. I think it's toxic as fuck. I want it to die a fiery death. I think that everybody's going to deal with shit like this in a different way. And maybe your way of doing it is to forgive. And if that is your way of doing it because you did the work to figure out what you needed to do, more power to you. More power to Leslie. I have no judgment for her. Whatever she had to do. However, I think a lot of people feel pressure to forgive. I hate hearing it when horrible things happen that are inexcusable and unforgivable. And I don't believe that everyone would do it if there wasn't the pressure to do it. And lastly, have you ever noticed how people who harp on forgiveness culture keep changing the fucking definition of forgiveness in order to justify forgiveness?
No, that never happened.
For you, it's for you. You have to let go. Okay, I can let go without having any fucking positive feelings for the person who did it. I am capable of that. And also, for the record, I'm not going to fucking let go. I will heal in hell. I do not give a shit. It does not. I've been in therapy for most of my adult life, and I don't let go of anything, and I'm fine. I'm fine. The mental issues that I have to do with fucking synapses and connections that were made well before forgiveness was an option. I don't believe in forgiveness. I believe forgiveness is a choice that you make. It is a gift that you give, and if you don't want to give it to somebody, who fucking cares? And Jim Jones doesn't deserve an ounce of that energy. Not an ounce.
And like you and I both agree that if that's how Leslie wants to approach it to get through her trauma and heal, great for her.
Yeah.
I am not that person. I am not that person.
And I just, like I said, she's a fucking badass, right? Like she's going through the jungle with her fucking preschool kid on her, not a baby. A child on her back.
Strapped onto her with a sheet. Like she just took a sheet and wrapped it around. She's like, I'm just going to go. Fuck this.
Baby Bjorn, guys. She's a badass. And the fact, again, that she has had a productive life at all. Mind-boggling. This is resilience I cannot imagine. She's fucking amazing. And if that is what it took for her, then I'm all for it. If that is what it takes for somebody listening to me right now, go for it. But if you're sitting there right now and you're like, man, I didn't go through anything like Jonestown, but I really struggle with forgiving my dad, or I really struggle with forgiving my ex, or fucking whatever. That's okay. Let go of the need to forgive and do whatever it is that you need to do to heal and feel better and move on with your life. Because I've done some amazing things in my life to deal with my trauma, and not one of them was forgiving anybody. And I feel great. I really do.
Yeah, same. And I'm just going to leave it at that because, another point I want to make is, because we're running up here in 2 hours, the mass grave situation in Oakland, they just dropped all these people. That I imagine there had to be some people like, no, I want my person that I care about buried at these places. I would imagine that happened, but that was a mass grave. That means a bunch of people were just like, fuck that, just let them go there. Like,
I think also you have to consider that there might have been a large number of people there who did not have family outside of Jonestown. Because remember, what we know about cult psychology is that you don't end up in a cult if you're in a good place in your life. And there's a lot of people in the People's Temple who became involved when it really was like this progressive social movement that happened to be a church and then got kind of taken away in the tide. But there were also people who joined after shit was getting crazy. Mm-hmm. And in addition, in both instances, like one, you just have people like, I don't have anybody else. But in the people who joined in the beginning, they might have brought everybody with them.
Yeah. It was just an interesting thing that was just like, oh, they made a mass grave in Oakland, California. And I was just like, I'm not sure why Oakland, whatever, but maybe that's just where they had the space.
Were from Indiana, and a lot of them were from San Francisco and Los Angeles. So yeah, it's kind of weird. And I think you're probably right that some number of those people did have family that just decided that they didn't want them. And that's due to the stigma and the way that the story was reported. And I'll fucking die on that hill.
Yeah. Okay. One other, if you want to end on a good note, we could talk about Jackie Spire, who took her 2 months to recover in the hospital after her gunshot wounds. And then 30 years later after that, she won a seat in the House, which was the seat that Leo Ryan held. And she was sworn in by none other than Nancy Pelosi. So it's full circle.
But yeah, I thought that was great. And I think if you remember, she said when she was going to go on this trip, a lot of people told her not to go. And she felt that it was her responsibility to go. One, because it was her fucking job. But two, that while women were fighting for the right to have these jobs, if she said she wasn't going to go because it wasn't safe, that she would be holding other women back.
Yep.
And I hate that has to be part of anybody's thought process, but it was 1978, guys. Like,
yeah, the idea that she was doing this in 78. Like that was not the hotbed of women's rights. I mean, like you still couldn't get like credit scores and shit like that. I don't think at that point, or like credit cards.
It'd been a few years, but
it was not. You were still in the infancy of that.
Yeah,
like good on her.
Yeah, so I think she's very inspirational. I don't know much about her politics. I don't want to like co-sign on her as like a politician, but as a human being, I know. But as a human being, it's a great story of survival, and that is a great story about coming full circle. And again, most people cannot win a seat in Congress. Even fewer people can do it after what she went through in Jonestown. Even fewer people would want to even try.
Yeah. She's 74 years old. She served from 2008 to 2023, Leo Ryan seat as a member of the Democratic Party.
So fingers crossed. But yeah, no, I think she's very inspirational. And I think, like I said, she talks about, she was saying, whatever the Catholic prayer is for people who don't have a priest to give them the last rites.
Some kind of thing.
I can't remember. My Catholic family, the only active members of the Catholic side of my family are dead.
Well, then they're not active, are they?
Not anymore. I guess we'll find out when I die. But
maybe.
She was laying on an airstrip in fucking Guyana waiting to die. And she served right up until last year. Like, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So that was the One Day in Jonestown Cult Massacre, which I think we both agree was far better than the first documentary we watched. Just be prepared. If you're going to watch this, it's going to be heavy.
Rough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's done by National Geographic, so they were going to be a little bit more true to the storylines and not make some storyline up like the last one, which you and I thought that last one would be intriguing to see the women behind Jonestown, which was nonsense. Next month, we're going to wrap up our Jonestown coverage as we talk about Jonestown, the life and death of the People's Temple. This is something that is on YouTube. I have not found it on anywhere else.
It is a PBS documentary originally, but this is the only place I could find it to stream. and it is known for being a lot more straightforward. Here's the footage. Here's the facts. I haven't watched it yet, so if that isn't accurate, I apologize in advance. Yeah. I don't know if it's going to be any easier to watch. I think there's an argument to be made that being very dry about it could also be really fucking weird. But I like the idea of the life and death of the People's Temple. I'm hoping they'll get more into what was happening in Indiana and San Francisco before they went to Guyana, because I find that very interesting. And again, cannot recommend Jeff Gwynn's book, The Road to Jonestown, enough. Yeah. It gives you a lot of context on the People's Temple and Jim Jones as a human being that, I mean, what documentary can fit it all in? I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Well, that means so that would be on October 2nd, I believe. Let me just double check that. Yes, October 2nd will be the next show. That will be the last of our trilogy on Jonestown.
Moving on, and I don't think I'll be sad.
Yeah, me either. This is a heavy one because it is probably the most well-known of all the cults, and especially with the body count, just makes it super sad. So yeah, it's
going to be a while before we do Heaven's Gate, let's just say that.
Yeah, that one's going to have to wait a while. But anyway, folks, thanks again for joining us as always, and thanks for making comments and all that, and we look forward to talking to you in less than a month at this point. So
oh yeah
so all right, folks, do take care, and we will see you in a month.